Yes. And here I am with my arm twisted to do this. Thank you, Jamie. You owe me. And I will get my revenge. No, I'm really pleased to introduce Michael D. Giovine to come and talk to us this afternoon. He's had quite a busy time over the past few days. He gave a talk at the conference in Ironbridge a couple of days ago, and he's, I know you've been talking to our MA students.
Yeah, we just got done.
And tomorrow you will be doing something with our PhD students, so if you get the chance to sleep, well done. And today you're talking about your particular interest in terms of pilgrimages and tourism.
Sure.
So at this point I hand over to you. So thank you.
Thank you. Thanks. Who went to the how many went to the conference? Did we get? Yeah, a bunch of you guys. Yeah, I noticed a bunch of you. Good. So for those of you who attended the conference, I'm Michael D. Giovine. I'm an assistant professor of anthropology at Westchester University outside of Philadelphia. So that's why I have this accent. Now I feel very... But, and my work, is in heritage and tourism and pilgrimage. I was a tour operator for a while before going back to school and studied UNESCO's World Heritage Program and then pilgrimage. So, Jamie said this is being videotaped or audio taped and everything, so I wrote something, but unfortunately I have to stand here because I got to use, I can't even pull the mouse out. So anyway, so for those of you who, so I apologize that I'm doing that. For those of you who attended our conference, you know that we spoke a good deal about heritage being affective, that it moves, it even seduces people to have shared emotional experiences with a site. The word Mike Robinson used was transcendent, beyond the local, beyond the here and now. But we didn't really talk about the mechanisms of affect, particularly about how heritage visitation and the emotions that it elicits are fundamentally embodied. That is, they encompass all the senses as we conduct our touristic practices to gain this affective feeling of transcendence. So when I think of transcendent experience of this site, I think first and foremost about pilgrimage and religious experiences. We can think about transcendentalism, of course, which is this American spiritual movement of the 19th century, where philosophers and literary writers like Emerson and Thoreau were moved by the natural world, the works of God. But we can also think of built religious sites, such as those great temples and basilicas that make it onto UNESCO's World Heritage List. Those performances, rituals, and practices they shape allow worshipers to go above and beyond the social world, making them closer to God. So since Jamie asked me to speak to, you guys are master's and PhD researchers, I thought what would be nice then was, instead of talking more about UNESCO and everything, is to talk a little bit about my dissertation, my own dissertation, and in America, dissertation is your PhD. So my PhD, whatever the heck you call it, research on a pilgrimage to a Catholic shrine, okay? So while pilgrimage or religious experiences might not seem so automatically, come to mind when thinking about secular heritage, the two are actually quite linked. So I recently edited, I don't know what that's, but I recently edited a special thematic issue of the International Journal of Tourism Anthropology with my good friend Josep Maria Garcia Fuentes, who's an architect and architectural historian up in Newcastle. He's Catalan. He's great. So read his stuff. He works also on pilgrimage and heritage and tourism. But in it, we made the case that pilgrimage and heritage are linked, with pilgrimage sites often turning into heritage sites later in their lifeways, such as those designations of former pilgrimage sites on those in the World Heritage List. But also how heritage takes on this transcendent, almost secularly spiritual connection with its travelers, who actually will call their visits pilgrimages. So pilgrimage and heritage sites are defined through similar notions of temporality and spatiality. That is, they're thought to transcend time and space. The great historians of religion, Mircea Eliade, for example, have called pilgrimage sites the axis mundi of a culture. The navel of the world, the belly button of the world, literally, which links the material dimension to the spiritual world, the profane to the sacred, earth to heaven and hell, but also time. It links time, it links past, present, and future with sacred timelessness, with the existence that seems to resist the linear flow of time. Axes mundi are created through what he calls the eruption of the sacred into the profane world, an explosion of cosmological perfection into a human existence marked by chaos. We're drawn to these places, he argues, precisely because we yearn to go back to that earlier golden age. Pilgrimage sites are therefore sites of morality, sites where society seeks to recreate ideal human and spiritual values, where we strive towards perfection. So maybe you see where heritage fits in here. Heritage sites are first and foremostly containers for the production and reproduction of social groups, predicated on similar forms of rituals that recreate and concretize the worldviews and beliefs of a group. A heritage site is typically understood as a timeless link to the past in the present and going into the future, or a confirmation. It is also thought of as a confirmation of an identity or memory in a volatile present. They're not ideologically neutral at all, nor are they or their claims objective or a priori. Rather, heritage is always, quote, a subjective political negation of identity, place, and memory. And it's something that is done rather than something we simply have or curate or protect. Heritage, as David Harvey points out, is therefore a process, just as pilgrimage is, which is a set of embodied activities, being bodily, of embodied activities aimed to inculcate and express a particular worldview through physical engagement with a past that we yearn to recreate. This entails an attempt to establish a set identity of a group or society through the preservation of heritage sites, their boundaries, and also, lastly, their transformation into these fixed and somehow sacred and revered objects, which generates a geography composed of bounded, contained spaces. So we were talking earlier about the heritage scape, this concept of the heritage scape as being kind of unbounded and fluid. Yet, when we look at these actual heritage sites, like Jamie pointed out in the talk, they're very bounded and fixed and in little categories and compartmentalized. And that helps us, grasp it. So we already can see the phenomenological links to pilgrimage sites. Heritage sites are places designated by humans in which the sacred nature of a group erupts into the chaos and uncertainty of the present. They're once again places in which the cosmogonic myths, which is a big word, it means an origin myth, of a social group, whether it's sacred or secular, are concretized, referenced, and reproduced. Eliade's conceptions of the sacred and profane are again apropos here. Cosmogonic myths are narratives that explain worldviews, and that's his definition. He argues they constitute a group's sacred history. They explicate a social group's origins, posit its overarching values and ethics, reveals social hierarchy, and seeks to explain total reality and to justify reality's contradictions. In short, heritageness, as a word that Mike Robinson used the other day, as he called it, provides the grounds for human history. Heritage may therefore be described as a means of transmission of ideas and values and a knowledge that includes the material, the intangible, and also the virtual. These are meanings and symbolic values that have been created by specific people who accept them for a specific purpose, which is almost always that of fostering the definition of a group from the local to the global, since heritage is by definition ours, and it's often ours and not yours, right? Both of these types of sites are affective. And by affect, we mean these highly visceral emotional sensations that seem to erupt above and beyond conscious understanding and rational responses, and which move across people, objects, and relations. Affect theorists often talk of this impersonal or like an interpersonal intensities that belong not to a single subject or object. So this idea of like, what's that word? Like the crowd, when the crowd moves you, all of a sudden you're caught up in this crowd and you start rioting and stuff. That's affect, crowd mentality and stuff. But they reside in what anthropologists like Paul Stoller called the liminal space in between. The space in between, or what we call liminality, is a creative space. It's most frequently constructed through the drama of rituals, in which social actors are betwixt and between, as Victor Turner called it, betwixt and between statuses, epistemologies, or knowledges, and social groups in time frames, and therefore provide the conditions to act out, intensify, or transform ideals, expectations, or aspirations that we often collectively conceive, embrace, or negotiate, but which may or may not be rationally acceptable or appropriate in daily life. And pilgrimage does this. So one more thing, and then we'll get to the fun part, which is at its core, I know it's kind of boring, at its core, pilgrimage is a ritual journey from a quote, and this is kind of my definition that I've been using a lot. It's a ritual journey from the quotidian realm, or the everyday realm of profane society, to a sacred center, an emotional and hyper-meaningful voyage, which, though individually experienced, is a social process in nature. So I use the term hyper-meaningful here specifically to reveal its affective nature. Being hyper-meaningful does not necessarily reference conscious perception or comprehension of its importance. As something hyper or ultra-meaningful, it produces a surplus, an overflow, or intensity of significance that seems to exist above and beyond rational meaning, a linguistic trope that actually a lot of pilgrims often use. They often say we're doing pilgrimage, not tourism. We're doing something above and beyond. And it's not what we mean by hyper-meaningful, right? Oftentimes when it's meaningful, they say it's tourism. When it's hyper-meaningful, all of a sudden it becomes a pilgrimage. And that's why I think heritage sites often, provoke that hyper-meaningfulness. So lest it seem that I'm referring to exclusively to religious pilgrimage, I should note that travelers themselves call secular trips pilgrimages when they acknowledge such voyages, from roots and heritage tourism to the Elvis's Graceland and the Baseball Hall of Fame, which down here looks very much, I don't know if you guys have this, but American mausoleums look like this, to, of course, these Trekkie conventions. People have all written about them as pilgrimages because their informants have called them that. So the seemingly irrational effects of hyper-meaningfulness in pilgrimage are oftentimes, but by no means exclusively observable, and different theorists have attempted to label these reactions in a way that are equally empirical and rational. So what I mean by that is psychologists get all these syndromes, right? They don't really know what it is, but they call they're syndromes. They're not normal, right? So you have the Stendhal syndrome, which is this psychosocial reaction to looking at pictures and swooning and crying and fainting. And Stephen Greenblatt wrote his great Pictures and Tears, a book very old now, but really great about the Stendhal syndrome. You got the Jerusalem syndrome, which is the sudden revelation by about 50 people a year have these revelations when they visit Jerusalem that they suddenly think that they're Jesus. So it's true, it's a syndrome. Now, is it psychological, or is God maybe telling them they're Jesus? Right? And the Paris syndrome is also a syndrome, tendency by Japanese tourists to actually commit suicide after visiting Paris because Paris sucks so much. No, but really, it's because of these imaginaries. No, I'm sorry for French. No, because they have these built-up imaginaries, right? And you pay so much, you expect so much of it, and those touristic expectations aren't fulfilled. And sometimes there's a loss of face and things like that, and it's actually, a syndrome. So, as syndromes, when we call them syndromes, they're conceived of as manifestations of attack from outside the body, or at least from outside of the rational or physical control of the person. Yet these and others, such as the common smelling of roses and violets by Catholic and Muslim pilgrims, denoting that they're in the presence of a saint. I got rid of that picture. There's when I was in Konya, they have part of the beard hair, the mustache hair of the Prophet Muhammad, and they have little holes in the box that you can smell the rose, smell this perfume of sanctity, as Catholic theologians call it. So you get these, these seem to be something that goes beyond rational thought here. And that's affect. It's what Bertelsen and Murphy point out. It's cross-temporal. It goes across times, pointing to a future that obscured in the present. Okay, so I want to pick apart this last point here, that this primacy of affect is existing in liminality, right? The in-between areas, between an object and the seemingly irrational responses to it, by discussing the responses to a major event in the global Catholic saints cult of Padre Pio of Pietrelcina. I was cutting ahead there. In particular, I'll use collective affect theory to demonstrate that how we share similar emotional connections we have with pilgrimage and heritage sites to reach transcendence, but I'm going to do so by contrasting how society has historically understood how we can achieve that transcendence based on whether it's a religious site, a pilgrimage site, or a heritage site. And I think that this is a very interesting point for those of you who are studying heritage, and especially if you're dealing with religious sites or sites that go beyond secular, everyday norms, you'll see that maybe, the body is disciplined in different ways. So while both are embodied in affective practices, certain historical shifts brought about the heritage turn in the late 1800s, early 1900s, changed the way that society says we're supposed to interact with these sites, such that when we interact with them, we're called to use different embodied practices in different senses to achieve a similar effect of transcendence and moral enlightenment. So, just like you, I did my PhD, and then it's gone on beyond that, obviously. So I've been conducting ethnographic research on pilgrimage and heritage production at the shrines to the saint Padre Pio, from 2008. During my dissertation, I lived in his hometown and elsewhere in Italy. So this is his shrine. I'll be talking about this shrine mostly. This is the hometown where my family's from, but also Padre Pio's from. I'll be talking a little bit, I'll show you a picture about Rome. So it's all in southern Italy here. I lived in his hometown and elsewhere in Italy, traveling predominantly with Italian and Irish pilgrims. He is the most prayed to saint in Italy, Ireland, and the Philippines. So very global, and he's well known in America, and especially among those populations. So very important. So 2008 2010 was what I call my dissertation, my PhD thesis. And I've continued visiting holy sites yearly in Italy, and also those shrines in the United States, such as this fantastic National Center for Padre Pio in Bartow, Pennsylvania, which is about 45 minutes from my house. And you're going to see pictures, okay? I just showed you Pietrelcina. She literally rebuilt her shrine in this farmland in rural Pennsylvania to be his hometown. And this, keep in mind this right here. This is going to look exactly like his church in the shrine. Really fantastic. And you're going to see that Padre Pio is famous for building a really big hospital, and it's kind of secret knowledge, but she wants to build a big hospital here too. But not pretty obvious that's what she wants to do. But and also I've traveled around when, for the first time, for example, Padre Pio's heart came to Boston. It was the first time his body part ever left Italy. And so I got a call from the Boston Globe asking me to comment on it. And I said, oh shit, I have to go up to Boston. I didn't know this was happening. All right, I gotta go. So I went up there for that and got my very good friend, my best friend from childhood, who's a photographer, to take those pictures, which are great. And then also I took 5 students with me in 2016 when Pope Francis declared it the Jubilee Year of Mercy in the Catholic Church. He ordered Padre Pio's body down with another saint into St. Peter's. It's the first time Padre Pio bodily left that town of San Giovanni Rotondo since 1918. So who was Padre Pio? He was a 20th century Catholic mystic and stigmatic who was an object of extreme popular devotion in his lifetime, thanks to his stigmata. So there you go. Supernatural abilities in the construction of this cutting-edge research hospital. As early as 1918, when Pio first experienced the stigmata while praying in a choir loft at his church, people considered him a living saint. And worshippers, and this is the choir loft, worshippers flocked to his monastery high atop the arid cliffs of the Gargano Peninsula for the opportunity to confess their sins to him. He was said to know their transgressions even before they would say them. And he would kick you out. I know you're hiding this thing, and you don't get absolution. So prayer groups endorsed by Pio himself in the 1950s spread across modern Christendom, taking particular hold in Ireland and the United States. While the Vatican hierarchy, including Popes Pius XI and John XXIII, saw him and his popular religious movement as a threat, others cultivated pilgrimage to the cult, and his charisma, which is integral to any popular saint, only grew after his death. Today, Pio is one of the world's most popular saints. More Italians and Irish pray to him than Jesus, the Virgin Mary, or St. Francis. And his cult boasts a global network of powerful prayer groups, a shrine complex designed by internationally renowned architect Renzo Piano, and a mass media empire that nets over 120 million euros annually. Pope John Paul II, as a young priest, actually visited Padre Pio, and one of the things he really wanted to do before he died was to canonize him. And this is one of the largest canonization ceremonies in St. Peter's ever. But tensions flared right when I was doing my research, which was great for me. In 2008, when Pio was exhumed from his tomb, dug up, and below the church that he built here, he built this church. See, that was that little church before, and then he built this big one in about 1956. And that's where he was buried. To accommodate the crush of pilgrims and tourists, and exhibited for 17 months, much to the chagrin of many devout followers. Indeed, as the shrine complex developed and modernized into an international tourist destination, different groups had different reactions and embodied responses to those changes. Now, this was an extremely controversial act, and devotees, particularly those who had met him or had made multiple trips to his tomb, complained that these friars were trying to commodify his tomb, making it a tourist site. A faction even sued the shrine in Italian court for desecrating his body. They also feared, correctly it turns out, that the friars were going to move his body to this garish new basilica, megachurch, built by Renzo Piano next door. And of course they were on television saying, no, we're not going to do it. But they did it. They knew they were going to do it. This ultramodern basilica could accommodate nearly 30,000 devotees inside and outside, and featured cutting-edge modern art and sculpture by some of the leading artists in Italy. And this, in particular, is designed by Arnaldo Pomodoro, who's he's famous for doing these bronze globes that are fractured, and one's in front of the UN building, one's in the Vatican Gardens. There was one on my University of Chicago campus where I did my PhD. So, it's really famous people, internationally renowned people. The capstone of the basilica, though, was his new crypt, financed by Filipino prayer groups, which featured scintillating golden mosaics made by melting down all of the gold rings, necklaces, and jewelry that were given as ex-votos by devotees. And ex-votos are these objects donated in request for a miracle, or in thanksgiving for having had a grace or a miracle. But devotees complained this was too luxurious, too self-congratulatory, too modern for Pio, who was just a simple friar who wanted to pray and who donated the money given to him during his lifetime to construct one of the most technologically advanced hospitals in Italy, and it's still a very good hospital. Long story short, despite the monks denying they'd move the body, they wouldn't move the body, they did, and they put him in this golden crypt, much to the chagrin of the devotees. But now this is where affect theory becomes a useful way of looking at things. The modernity and grandeur of the new basilica might not actually be the source of the critics' unease, but rather the way it subtly but materially impacted their devotional habitus, which is like a way of saying like the learned, the things that you do with your body without even thinking about it. Like I keep bumping into people because I keep walking on the right side instead of the left side. Right? That's a habitus. You learn it, but it seems very natural. It's like, when you walk in a room, you just click the light switch or something like that, and then you move a house or something, and you're like, where's the light switch in the bathroom? Right? That's the same thing. So there's a devotional habitus that these people have, and it might stem that when you shift it to a tourist or heritage site, you're doing something different with your habitus, rather than the desecration of the body. So there are three things actually. So we're going to look at the goals and objectives of material change. Exchange of the site might be different. Bodily discipline and interactions with Pio's remains, and what types of memories should be called upon. I'm probably running out of time. Right? Seasoned pilgrims. So these are pilgrims that always come. Often argue. I love that picture. I wish I took it. I just ripped it off the internet. Seasoned pilgrims often argue that the exhumation and promised veneration was merely a thinly veiled excuse to garner more tourism dollars in response to a decline in pilgrims after Pio's canonization. And it is true to a certain extent in tourism management. So in this frenzy of mass tourism that occurred in the years leading up to Pio's canonization, the town of San Giovanni Rotondo saw the construction of some 125 hotels, and some of them very luxurious, like this one. But clearly they were overbuilt. At the opening of the veneration in 2008, so what was that, 6 years later, the occupancy rates were the lowest in all of Italy. And newspapers, decried his shrine as the Las Vegas of the faithful, a cheap and inauthentic yet glitzy commercial tourist trap. However, this reaction isn't necessarily unique to Padre Pio's cult. This is where history comes in. Popular anti-clericalism, as it's called, and direct opposition to the religious hierarchy is very strong in southern Italy, France, Spain, and Portugal. So as one of my colleagues, Ellen Badone, asserts, these cultures continue to privilege direct and reciprocal relations over more rational, economic, and legalistic ones that the Council of Trent, after the Protestant Reformation, instituted within the Catholic world. And then they criticize attempts by the Vatican to come in and co-opt the charisma of saints as a commercialization. But on the other hand, Irish Catholics, who exist, I don't know if anybody's Irish here, but I know you're Irish, and Bostonian, and you're Irish. Right? Irish Catholics who exist as minorities in this Anglo-British milieu, as we know, are generally more responsive to forms that reveal the wealth and strength of the cult and the church in general. So actually, as an aside, I know I told you guys this, some of my friends, you guys this before, but even during the times of troubles in Northern Ireland, the Catholics would go and they would throw Padre Pio prayer cards into the foundations of buildings of public housing so that the Protestants wouldn't take it. So they was claiming it for the Catholics. So this is Padre Pio is deeply rooted in their culture for other things that doesn't have to do with devotion to God. Right? So in one bus ride to the Rome airport, and this is part of my research, they asked me to be the tour guide after a year of just being a pilgrim with them. And so you can't ask the same questions to people. If you're the tour guide, I'm giving you the answers of who Padre Pio is, so I can't ask that anymore. So I would do these little focus groups, and I'd hold the microphone, and we'd have little conversations on the phone, on the bus, and I would ask them about, what do you think of this? Because Italians hate it; they really always criticize it. And one man integrated distinctively Irish imaginaries with that of San Giovanni Rotondo. He said, quote, "Somebody might disagree with the amount of money that was spent on Renzo Piano's basilica because there's so much poverty in the world. But in Ireland, in times past, there was poverty and famine. The only thing that stood out and remained past those generations are the churches. Hopefully, this church will outlive our generation too." Right, so they were looking at it through their lens. People make meanings of these things differently. And from these reactions, it seems that these tensions stem not from commercialism itself, but rather the purpose of commercialism. For this, we have to look at exchange of money and material objects through the lens of Mossian gift giving. So Marcel Mauss, if you guys study sociology or anthropology, was the nephew of Durkheim, who was the father of sociology and anthropology. And he looked at this Polish anthropologist, Malinowski's Kula exchange. There were all these islands in the South Pacific that would exchange these shells and everything. And he said, you know what, these are gifts. Shells are gifting, right? And there's a purpose for gifts. Gifts are an exchange of indebtedness that construct and solidify social relations. So I love teaching this to class. I tell people, the difference between a gift and like a commercial exchange is, with a commercial exchange, I could go and I buy something, and I'm going to buy this thing from you, and I give you £5, and I go back, and we don't ever have to talk again. I never have to see you again, right? But I think that's, you go to wherever, Burger King or something, and do the same thing. But with gifts, right, you give a gift one day, and then you wait for it to return maybe on your birthday. You give a gift, if I remember and then you don't give me a gift. Well, I feel upset, right? And you feel, well, what has he done? He doesn't like me? Is our relationship broken here? Right? Because gifts really are an exchange of indebtedness, and that indebtedness has to be repaid over time. You're always thinking about the person. My mom's an Italian kind of farmer, and she writes down all the money that everybody gives us for every single. I know it's very insulting to my wife's very Anglo family as well. That they're people are giving us money, and we write down every kind of dollar. He gave you $5, you gave $10, this and that. But then when it's time for your birthday, just look it up. All right, he gave you $10. That's really being brash about it. But that's what gifting is, right? It's just in your face, the way that we do things. I'm from New Jersey. Everything's in your face. So while commercial exchange persists, okay, so this is the thing. Formerly, the priest or the vendor of holy relics, whether they're genuine or not, were no more than middlemen facilitating this exchange of indebtedness with God. Because they're giving money. They always shove money in priests' hands and stuff because they're trying to connect to God, right? And it's a very Catholic thing. It's very much not a Protestant kind of a thing. But that's what they're doing. But with the Council of Trent, which was responding to the Protestant Reformation, and also this idea of the more modern heritage, touristic kind of way of doing things, this becomes just a commercial exchange. It becomes that commercial exchange like this that people don't know what to do with. It kind of cheapens it. It takes God out, and that's not the purpose of why they want to give the money to the church or to the vendor. Now they're just giving it to the global capitalistic market, like this. And you can see all the stuff that they buy. And they do buy these things, like cigarette lighters and perfumed rosaries and things like that. But what the Irish will do, and what others will do, is they'll do these elaborate practices then of an inventio. Inventio, theologically, the term is to convert anything into relics, or recognize them as relics. So they convert these souvenirs into relics by going, I don't have a picture, here it goes. By going, for example, there's an Irish lady, this is a mitt of Padre Pio. So the Irish have a particular devotion to the glove of Padre Pio because it touches blood. And so whenever anyone's sick, they call up their prayer group, and then they drive out from Derry or wherever, and they lay it on the person, and they say some prayers, and the person is cured. I have like 100 miracle stories of people with all kinds of epilepsy, hemophilia, all kinds of things. And they feel, they'll tell me they'll feel the energy coursing through their body. They smell the roses or violets. So this thing they think has kind of magical, I don't want to cheapen it, but this idea of contagious magic, which is another anthropological idea, where you can transfer magic from one thing to another, right? So they take the rosaries they just bought, or those cigarette lighters, or even now, the last time I was there, people were taking out their cell phones and putting pictures of their loved ones and touching it to the relic. And that magic, that holiness is going to go off onto the picture, and it's going to get and go off on the person, right? So that's the way that they start to deal with trying to create that connection with God. And then they'll bring those lighters and stuff to the people at home who couldn't make the pilgrimage. So number 2, and this is kind of where I'm getting at the most, is most importantly, these practices are indicative of tensions that arrive through the second type of shift that I mentioned, which is a conversion of it from a pilgrimage site to a heritage site, compels the visitors to discipline the senses in a way that conflicts with that of religious devotion. In this case, the interaction is more along the lines of post-Enlightenment modern tourism. So the one thing that post-Enlightenment did, or the Enlightenment did, was shift the locus to where the place that we obtain truth about ourselves and our existence from God to now our eyes in the material world. Right? I think, therefore I am, Descartes said. Not I believe, like the church in the Middle Ages said you had to do, which is called fideism. In the Middle Ages, they said, just don't worry about it. We'll tell you what is science and the earth revolving around the sun and the sun revolving around the earth and everything. Don't worry about it. But in the Enlightenment, we say, no, I need to see it and test it to believe it, right? So it shifts from God to the material world. In St. Augustine's theology, man as a created being is necessarily incomplete. Therefore, we can't get that sense of fullness of self or complete understanding of the self unless we tap into the truth that's given to us by the soul, in his idea, through which God speaks directly to us. But now the Enlightenment left God out of this, and at least for how we can achieve a more perfect understanding of ourselves. So we now gain this complete understanding based on what we can empirically prove in the material world. And there's a very specific way of interacting with place that's very different from the religious way, where at least popularly, you have to encounter God bodily in southern Italy and stuff like that, both interiorly and exteriorly. Rather than privileging the haptic or sense of touch, as in popular religion, we touch everything. Italians are touching all kinds of things. The Irish you saw were touching the things. The Enlightenment era thinking privileged what sense? Does anybody know? Yeah, the eyes, right? They called it the upper sense, the higher sense, and all the other ones were the lower senses. They literally said there's better senses than others, right? The eyes are the privileged ones, and then the smell and hearing and all the other stuff. And you think these Catholics, with the incense and the bells and smells, as we used to say, all these other senses come into play, right? And high Anglicanism too, right? Rather than privileging the haptic or sense of touch, they privileged the visual and relegated touching, hearing, and smelling to lower levels. Tourism, if we think about it as an interaction predicated on sightseeing, or what Uri called the tourist gaze, also privileges a sense of sight over the other senses. You can't touch, right? You can't touch Stonehenge. You can't touch the Mona Lisa, right? You're not supposed to. You look, don't touch, right? Svetlana Alpers calls this the museum effect on objects. When they become museumified, she says objects are always put under the pressure of seeing. Right? They have to put under this pressure. They have to be visual. Whereas before, pilgrims would touch Pio's tomb, kneeling and praying at it and putting flowers on it and leaving notes on it. Now, Pio is in this glass case, right? Up high, blocked off by these red velvet ropes, and pilgrims can only walk around it, circumambulating it like an object in a museum. They're hurried along by guards barking, "Keep moving, please," like you're in the Sistine Chapel. You just look up, if you stop, they start yelling at you. Or in Vietnam too, you go to Uncle Ho's tomb and you have to kind of just, you can't even really look, and you have to just kind of go like this as you walk around, right? You got to look, don't touch, don't stop moving. In short, the site managers transform pilgrims' haptic devotional practices shaped by popular religion to secular museological tourism practices that privilege the optic. So we can understand why, site managers intending to create this new Assisi, they always talked about it as, we want to create the new Assisi, why they chose Renzo Piano. Renzo Piano is famous for making museums. In fact, he never made a church before the one in San Giovanni Rotondo for Padre Pio. He's famous for museums, and then of course they put all this cutting-edge contemporary art, because this is about heritage, it's about museum, it's about trying to make something that will become valued in the future as 20th century heritage. So this is this cultural heritage cum tourist site, a vast open-air museum in which the objects to be studied, talked about, and visited weren't the holy relics, but monumental buildings, fine art, and a famous body that's on display. This is an epistemological shift away from utilizing Pio as a locus for getting certain truths about yourself and your spiritual path of salvation, to one that considers Pio as an object of cultural heritage, embodying certain facts about history, culture, and social relations. Such a shift also requires pilgrims to discipline their bodies in different ways. They can't touch it, right? They have to only look, sparking this extreme internal tensions, which are articulated in the form of these critiques over the materiality of the basilica. So particularly during the veneration of Pio's body, the pilgrim was specifically disciplined to gaze on Pio as a museum object, and also going through this whole pathway of semiotic framing elements, getting you there, to making you say, hey, you got to use a museological gaze. So first you'd enter in and you'd have to go through this whole museum. That was the first thing you do. And this, by the way, is a room of letters that came in a 3-month period of Padre Pio towards the end of his life. Thousands and thousands of letters that taken Irish pilgrims there, and they're like, oh, I bet mine is here somewhere. Really wonderful. I mean, the devotion is great. And the vestments he wore, the bloody stuff. You're going through, and they're all behind glass, just like any other museum. You visit his cell, you visit all this stuff, and finally, by the time you visit, this is the crucifix where he was praying under in 1918 and got his stigmata. And finally, when you get there, you're already primed. You're already been shaped to, this is the way we have to interact with him. We have to look at him from afar. He's raised up, he's higher up, he's behind glass. This, by the way, was by a British mannequin maker. So people would go and they just comment on how wonderful it is to see Padre Pio, but actually you're not seeing any of his actual body. This is a silicone mask. The only things you can see are the fingertips and stuff like that. But it was very much to me, I did some research on body worlds. I don't know if you know Gunther von Hagen's body worlds with their plastinated bodies. It's the same kind of thing. You're looking at it like a museum object, and you're kind of thinking about yourself, but it's highly mediated, right? Both of these things are really high levels and levels of mediation, but you think that you're getting into this direct contact with them. So now Pio's current placement in the Basilica crypt blends these two disparate expositionary styles. So during the translation, which, so this is, how do I go back? I don't know what happened. Anyway, during the translation, his body was put in this silver coffin by a Georgian architect, Gauguin, and was taken out and moved into the other church. And he was put in that golden crypt behind this gash here, so you could just barely see it. And of course, Americans, obviously looks like a Nike sign, right? And it was a very awkward affair because people have to line up, and you have to they want to touch it, and they're allowed to so they're trying to stick their hands in this gash, and they're throwing. This is the space between the silver coffin and the wall here, the mosaic wall. They're throwing their photos of their loved ones that they want healed and things, and flowers in there. It's this really awkward case, thing going on here, shaped by these conflicting cues on how Pio should be ritually approached. And as pilgrims proceed down the crypt, they pass through this gallery, also really interesting. So this beautiful mosaic cycle of, on one side is the life of St. Francis and the life of Padre Pio, because St. Francis was the first stigmatic, and Padre Pio was, the last, and the best, and you get to the end, and inside the crypt is Jesus, the one that they're copying. And, same kind of thing. Look, you have this museological story in different languages about what it is, and, you're there, and you kind of have to look back and kind of gaze at it like it's, studying it and everything else, instead of touching it or kissing it like, Italian Catholics definitely would do. So the space, and then of course you're there, and the space isn't, when you're down at that swish, that Nike swish, it's not really conducive to kind of touching, as we saw. The line of pilgrims blocked the entrance, the swish was too small, and the sarcophagus itself was placed just a little too far back behind the opening, forcing some shorter devotees to stretch and contort their bodies to touch it. So the placement of Pio's crypt exists midway between two conflicting architectural paradigms for interacting with relics, liturgical and museological. So the liturgical one, on the one hand, is Assisi, which is on the left here. This is the way that St. Francis is buried in here. They had to put him in lots of concrete because people kept stealing him. Well, the different friars, the black friars and the brown friars, would steal them from each other. And you can touch it, you can walk around it, circumambulate it, and that's okay. You don't have to see him. But then when the kind of the museological era came about, the king in Turin had Guarino Guarini do this kind of thing for the shroud. This is the Shroud of Turin, where you walk across it like a museum and kind of look and gaze at it, right? You kind of keep moving. So that the shrine is kind of caught between these two different types of styles on exhibitionary styles here. Now, I'm not suggesting, as many pilgrims do, that the basilica is poorly planned. What I'm suggesting, although my slide shows that, what I'm suggesting, however, is the progression of exhibitionary tactics regarding Pio from his first tomb to his temporary exhibition to his reinterment reflect a deeper yet necessarily ambivalent and tension-laden process of transformation for the shrine, as its managers ambitiously refashion their site as a secular tourism heritage destination akin to Assisi. It seemed that, and they would say this, I know I didn't say it in there, but talked to the mayor of Pietrelcina actually, and he said, we want to be the next Assisi. He says 90% of people go for Giotto and 10% go for the saint, right? We want to have them go for the art, just like, everything else, so that we can outlive. If the saint, already, Pope John Paul is now a saint, he's more, Mother Teresa's a saint, his devotion's waning and theirs is coming up, and so they need to have some other way to remain sustainable. So it seemed that site managers did not take into account the very visceral and embodied experiences. But thankfully, after a few years, they actually ripped down, they enlarged the slash there, and they alternated between putting him on display and keeping him in the sarcophagus. I think he's on display now permanently. While Pio's popularity, both when he was alive and when he died, was predicated on the cultivation of individual memories. This is the third point, is memories. Specific interactions with the saint, his tomb, and with friends and family members who knew or met him. As a new heritage site now, these memories are purposefully erased, right? The shrine needs to now start new memories, right? This is a different place. There's now heritage. We have this iconographic, those really nice mosaics cycle. This is now the narrative that you're supposed to know about Padre Pio now. Forget that your grandmother met him and he kicked you out of the confessional, which is what all the people have their own stories about. This is now the canonical story, just like Giotto has the fresco cycle in Assisi, if you go, of the life of St. Francis. And we think of St. Francis, we think of where his stigmata is, based on Giotto's paintings. We don't know where the stigmata was. In fact, I read a really interesting thing that actually, if you read the earliest writings about the stigmata from people who were with him, stigmata was not a bleeding hole at all. It was these bumps on his hand, because they were thinking it was the nail of the hand. But of course, we think, because of Giotto, we think that they're the holes. And for whatever reason, whatever psychological or psychosomatic or divine, Padre Pio has the holes in his hand, which we call culture-bound syndromes or things like that. That only Catholics who believe in the stigmata get the stigmata. Right? But thankfully, so they're trying to erase this. So during the translation, I'll just show you. So the translation is the official Catholic term for moving a relic, and moving a body. So during the translation of his body, which they tried to do in secret, they didn't really want to tell anybody, everybody showed up. They brought out the whole silver casket, and they moved it down. And I was circling around, and a lot of people thought I was a journalist because I was taking notes and taking pictures and stuff. And so they really wanted to tell me how pissed off they were. They were really mad. And so I was talking with them a lot, and they would keep talking about, right? They kept talking about their various pilgrimage experiences, venerating the tomb, talking about when their parents met him. They really wanted to talk about their memories of Padre Pio, right? And reliving the memories of the times they interacted with him in the friary or that venerated his tomb. These disgruntled informants spoke of an end of an era. They would talk about that. An end of a time when Pio was buried at a site filled with their own memories. While it may be hagiographically problematic about this phenomenon, is that these pilgrims don't espouse a unified view of Pio or his significance. Right? They all have their own individual memories. His translation to another structure, this church, not this one, the other church, that is devoid of all these memories of when they were there, right? To another structure, to this place, now is a clean slate, right? Can wipe everything clean, and the church can kind of start from scratch and create new memories, and ones that are more based on the materiality of the site. So basically, I attempted to introduce affect theory to the anthropological study of pilgrimage and heritage, which, while traditionally focused on collectively felt emotional responses to this hyper-meaningful site, has often conceived of them as a product of ritual. Here, I'm trying to use a slightly different and maybe more precise language to talk about a similar thing. These participants are existing in this space and a time that's in between paradigms for the shrine. And their emotional discord emerges precisely from the new ways in which they're acted on and made to act by site managers' aesthetic and policy decisions. On the one hand, they're emerging from and have been conditioned to a form of devotional habitus that privileges the haptic senses over the optic, one that promises to affect the devotee through sensations of revelation and transcendence. But on the other hand, these naturalized tendencies and behaviors are actively being suppressed by the site managers. They're told to look but don't touch, to be silent and respectful in prayer, to treat Pio as an exhibitionary object. And I was just in the museum, the geology museum today, and a school group came and they're telling them, shh, you know, and don't touch. That is the way Carol Duncan talks about this as a civilizing ritual. Museums, you know, they're teaching you how to be civilized, to be social, you know, just as much as anything else. And if anything, you know, it's Southern Italians are the most uncivilized, and I am. You know, they act in a way that really, to a lot of other people, will seem that they're not very, that they need to be conditioned a little bit. So, you know, they shifted this so that we could create new memories in this new basilica, so that the prayer groups can form on their own and they can kind of all be on the same page instead of this hodgepodge. And I think, you know, as you're thinking about site management and heritage management, you know, think about these issues. I mean, that's the reason why I selected this as opposed to something else for the heritage class. Thought, you know, to think anthropologically, socially, culturally about what happens to the actual person, their bodies, their expectations when these things happen, and what happens, because all these heritage sites are created. Now, I mentioned that in the talk the other day that I gave, that, you know, designating something, you're creating something new. They're not the same thing as they were before. Right? And then the management plans, the OUV or whatever, outstanding universal value, all these things, they're creating new narratives about the site, right? Like we were talking about in Antigua today, right? With, you know, you have a local view of what it could be, that it's a pretty place, right? And then you hear somebody else, oh, well, actually it's because it was a great place for this admiral to park his boat in, and, you know, that kind of stuff. Right, and all of a sudden, oh, you're creating something new. That wasn't your impression. That's not your experience with the site necessarily, but it's something that now we want everybody to have. But what does that do to the person who has a different experience with the site, different use of the site? You know, so that's kind of why I picked that. And I'll stop there. And you know, if you have any questions or anything, I'd be happy to answer that.
We have got time for a couple of questions. I'll just turn that off.
Or about any, you know.